She should have slapped her. Instead, she stood there while the other woman laughed in her face and tightened her grip around her husband's arm like she had just won a trophy. Amber Collins entered the ballroom of the Sterling Imperial Hotel as if she owned the skyline itself. Diamonds blazing at her throat, crimson silk clinging to her body, her laughter sharp enough to slice through crystal chandeliers and polite conversation. At 29, she had perfected the art of looking expensive, and tonight she paraded David Carter beside her as proof of her victory. David, 35, tall and newly confident in his tailored tuxedo, did not pull his arm away. He did not look ashamed. He looked proud. Lauren Carter stood only a few feet away, unnoticed at first, in her simple navy dress, her hair pulled back in a low knot, her makeup soft and understated. To the guests drifting past her, she looked like someone's forgotten wife, someone who had failed to keep up with the glittering pace of Manhattan ambition. Amber noticed her and smiled slowly the way predators do before they strike. She walked straight toward Lauren Heels, tapping like a countdown. Still shopping off the clearance rack, she asked lightly, though her voice carried. A few nearby guests turned their heads. David exhaled in irritation not at Amber, but at Lauren. "You didn't have to come tonight," he muttered as if her presence embarrassed him. Lauren felt the words land like cold rain down her spine, yet her face did not crack. She studied Amber's necklace, the gleaming bracelet, the ring on her manicured hand. She knew their weight. She knew their price. She knew with quiet certainty exactly which corporate account had paid for every shining detail. Amber leaned closer, lowering her voice, but not enough. "You really don't belong here," she whispered. "This is high society. You're suburban." The word dripped with disdain. Around them, laughter rippled softly. David shifted uncomfortable, but he did not defend his wife. He had changed in the past year, ambition sharpening him, polishing him, hardening him. The scholarship boy who once wore worn-out sneakers and swore love was enough had become an architect, hungry for prestige, for power, for rooms like this. Lauren saw it clearly now, the distance in his eyes, the quiet contempt he no longer bothered to hide. Yet what none of them saw was the stillness in hers, the calm of someone who understands the entire board, while the others fight over a single piece. The ballroom glittered under cascading light, floor-to-ceiling windows revealing the Manhattan skyline burning against the night. Waiters floated by with champagne that came from a private vineyard in Napa. The marble beneath their feet had been imported from Italy under a contract signed by a Sterling subsidiary. The hotel itself stood on land purchased decades ago by Sterling Global Holdings. Lauren's family name was etched invisibly into the steel beams, the foundations, the very air they breathed. But Lauren had spent the last 5 years burying that name, trading private jets for commuter trains, trading couture for cotton, hiding her inheritance behind freelance invoices and quiet devotion. She had wanted love stripped of calculation. She had wanted a man who chose her without knowing what choosing her truly meant. David glanced around the room, scanning for investors, for partners, for opportunity. He did not see the irony coiling around him. The credit card in his pocket, the one he had used to buy Amber that gaudy yellow diamond ring, was linked to a prime account under a holding trust he had never questioned. $50,000 a month in spending power had seemed like validation of his rising status. He had never asked how his income justified it. He had never asked why the bank approved his car lease despite his debt ratio. He had accepted the illusion eagerly. And Amber, sensing his hunger, had fed it with admiration and glitter. Lauren's gaze moved slowly from her husband to his mistress, from their intertwined arms to the guests watching with faint amusement. She felt the sting of humiliation, yes, but beneath it something colder stirred. Not rage, clarity. She remembered her father's voice years ago in their Hamptons estate, calm and measured as he explained market acquisitions. Power, Richard Sterling had said, is quiet. It does not argue. It waits. At 65, he had built a $50 billion empire from nothing, teaching his only daughter that the strongest move is often the one no one sees coming. Lauren had promised herself she would never use that power to dominate a man she loved. But standing there, listening to Amber's laughter echo off walls her family owned, she understood something had shifted irrevocably. Amber lifted her champagne flute and took a slow sip. "Enjoy the view," she said sweetly. "It's the closest you'll ever get to this life." David did not contradict her. He looked at Lauren with a flicker of impatience, as though willing her to disappear quietly so he could continue ascending without complication. For a fleeting second, pain flashed across Lauren's face. 5 years of shared breakfasts. 5 years of whispered dreams. 5 years of her quietly transferring funds from a private trust to ensure he never felt small again. She had dimmed her light so he could shine, and now he mistook her restraint for mediocrity. What none of them realized, not Amber with her glittering cruelty, nor David with his fragile pride, was that Lauren Carter was not a woman being pushed out of a room. She was the reason the room existed. The hotel manager across the floor caught sight of her and straightened instinctively. A board member from a fortune company whispered her maiden name under his breath in recognition uncertain. The night was only beginning. The humiliation felt public raw, almost unbearable. But beneath the surface, something ancient and unshakable rose within her. She did not need to shout. She did not need to defend herself. She only needed to make one call. The house in New Jersey had once felt like freedom. It stood at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac lined with maple trees that turned gold in the fall, its white siding modest, its porch light warm but unremarkable. Lauren had chosen it deliberately, a 3-bedroom suburban home far removed from Manhattan penthouses and private estates, a place where no one would look twice at her last name. 5 years earlier, she had walked through its empty rooms with David, imagining laughter in the kitchen children's drawings on the refrigerator, a life built from effort rather than inheritance. Back then, his hand had been steady in hers, his voice full of gratitude, and she had believed simplicity would protect what wealth often poisoned. She learned quickly how to make her privilege invisible. She traded silk blouses for cotton sweaters, designer heels for practical flats, and a chauffeured car for a 5-year-old Toyota that hummed reliably along the interstate. She introduced herself as Lauren Carter, freelance graphic designer, and let clients haggle over invoices she did not need to negotiate. Each month, without fanfare, she transferred funds from a private trust into their joint account under the guise of project payments. The mortgage disappeared quietly, and the second year paid in full through a restructuring she orchestrated behind the scenes. Yet David celebrated as if his promotion had made it possible. She never corrected him. She wanted him to feel strong. In the early years of their marriage, David had been earnest and hungry in a way that felt admirable. At 30, he was still climbing, sketching architectural models late into the night, dreaming of glass towers and city skylines. He used to thank her for believing in him when no one else did, used to kiss her forehead at 2 a.m, and whisper that one day he would give her everything. Lauren would smile in the dark, knowing she already had everything he was striving for and more. But she also knew that telling him would change the temperature of their love. She had seen men shrink under the weight of her family name. She had watched alliances shift the moment Sterling was spoken aloud. So she remained silent. Silence, however, has a way of breeding illusion. As David's career gained momentum, so did his appetite for validation. The new BMW lease. The tailored suits, the reservations at impossible restaurants that somehow always opened up when Lauren made a discreet call. He began to speak of circles she could not understand, of rooms where real power lived, of partners who measured worth in millions. Lauren listened, offering support without reminding him that she had grown up at tables where billion-dollar negotiations were discussed between courses. When the bank called to say his credit approval had failed, she handled it quietly through a shell corporation signing as guarantor, so he would never see the rejection. When he complained about rising interest rates, she arranged a restructuring that lowered them to nearly nothing. He never asked how. The first crack appeared not with Amber, but with impatience. David began to look at their home as if it were temporary, as if the chipped granite countertop and negotiated discount were evidence of stagnation rather than shared history. He criticized Lauren's coupon clipping, her reluctance to attend networking galas, her contentment with freelance work. "You don't push yourself," he once said over dinner, the words sharp but careless. She had swallowed the sting, reminding herself that love required grace. What she did not realize was that he had started to equate modesty with limitation, mistaking her choice for lack. Amber Collins entered his life at the architecture firm like a gust of perfume and ambition. Younger, loud, expertly dressed, she embodied the version of success David believed he was approaching. She praised his designs, laughed at his jokes, spoke fluently about high-end investments and private memberships. Lauren sensed the shift before she saw proof the way he lingered on his phone at night, the subtle impatience in his tone when she asked about his day. Still, she gave him space, believing loyalty was stronger than temptation. She did not know that while she was protecting his pride, he was quietly rewriting the narrative of their marriage. By the time Lauren stood in that Manhattan ballroom watching Amber cling to her husband, the suburban house had already become a stage set for a story David no longer valued. He thought he had outgrown it. He thought he had outgrown her. What he never understood was that every brick of his newfound confidence had been mortared with her invisible strength. And the moment she chose to withdraw it, the structure would not simply crack. It would collapse. The confession did not come with tears. It came with irritation. David stood in the kitchen beneath the soft yellow light, loosening his tie as if the marriage itself were an inconvenience he had outgrown. Lauren had just placed the credit card statement on the counter, the number circled in quiet ink. $12,000 at Cartier. Another 8 at a boutique in Soho. The scent of unfamiliar perfume still lingered faintly on his jacket. She asked who the bracelet was, for her voice steady but fragile at the edges, and he did not even attempt to lie. "Her name is Amber," he said almost impatiently, as though clarity were a favor. The air shifted in that moment, thick and irreversible. Lauren felt something inside her crystallize, not shatter. She had braced for suspicion, perhaps denial, but not contempt. David did not apologize. He leaned back against the marble counter and spoke of ambition, of circles she would never understand, of needing a partner who reflected the future he was building. He described Amber as vibrant, connected, sophisticated. He described Lauren as safe, predictable, small. The words struck harder than betrayal itself. He spoke as if the life they had built were an embarrassing draft he was ready to discard. She listened without raising her voice, watching the man she had loved reshape their history in real time. "You make me feel guilty for wanting more," he said finally, the accusation sharp. Lauren almost laughed at the irony. For 5 years she had been the silent architect of his more. The BMW lease he flaunted had required her signature through a discreet holding company when his credit was denied. The mortgage he believed he paid monthly had been extinguished 3 years earlier with funds from her trust. The $50,000 monthly spending limit on his supplementary card existed because she authorized it. Every symbol of success he wore like armor had been polished by her unseen hand. When he placed the divorce papers on the kitchen island, he did so with a rehearsed certainty that betrayed Amber's influence. He claimed he had been carrying the financial weight of their home while she played with design projects. He expected her to vacate the house by Friday. Lauren looked at the document without touching it. There was no dramatic outburst, no shattered glass, no pleading. Only a quiet realization that the man before her no longer recognized the ground beneath his own feet. He believed he was ascending. He did not see that he was standing on a foundation she could withdraw with a single decision. He left that night with a finality that felt theatrical, the door closing harder than necessary. Lauren stood alone in the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly too loud, the house too still. She ran her fingers along the edge of the counter they had chosen together, remembering how he once kissed her there after their first dinner as husband and wife. For a fleeting second, grief pressed against her ribs. She had not married him for status. She had loved the scholarship boy with holes in his shoes, the man who once said wealth did not define worth. Somewhere along the way, he had traded that belief for applause. Her phone lay on the table. She stared at it for a long moment before picking it up. The number she dialed had not been used in 3 years. When the call connected, a familiar British accent answered, composed and attentive. "Sterling residence," the voice said. Lauren closed her eyes briefly, feeling the weight of 2 identities collide. "This is Lauren," she replied, and for the first time in years her tone shifted, no longer shrinking to fit another person's comfort. "Tell my father I am coming home, and tell him I am ready." The gates of the Sterling estate opened without question. They always had. The long gravel drive curved through manicured lawns and ancient oak trees before revealing the Hamptons mansion in full, its white stone facade glowing under late afternoon light like something carved from permanence itself. Lauren stepped out of the car with a stillness that contrasted sharply with the quiet storm inside her chest. The last time she had walked these grounds, she had been determined to leave privilege behind. Now she returned not as a runaway seeking simplicity, but as a daughter who finally understood the cost of silence. Richard Sterling was waiting at the top of the front steps, tall despite his 65 years, silver hair, immaculate posture, unyielding. He did not rush forward. He did not demand explanations. He simply watched his daughter approach, reading the shift in her expression the way he once read market volatility. When Lauren reached him, the composure she had maintained for days trembled just slightly. He opened his arms and she stepped into them not as an heiress or strategist, but as a daughter who had loved and lost. His embrace was brief yet solid, the kind that restored equilibrium rather than dramatized pain. Inside, the estate moved with quiet efficiency. Staff members who had known her since childhood greeted her without surprise, their respect unchanged by her years of anonymity. The marble floors, the towering windows overlooking the Atlantic, the scent of polished wood and ocean air, all of it felt familiar yet distant, as if she were re-entering a life she had once pressed pause on. She walked through the halls lined with art collected over decades, remembering board meetings she used to sit in as a teenager, absorbing strategy like second nature. She had never been naive about power. She had only chosen not to wield it. That evening, father and daughter sat across from one another in Richard's private study, the walls lined with leather-bound volumes and framed acquisitions that had reshaped industries. He listened as she spoke, not interrupting, not offering immediate judgment. She told him about David's resentment, Amber's arrogance, the quiet financial scaffolding she had built beneath a man who mistook it for his own strength. Richard's jaw tightened once briefly when she described the public humiliation in Manhattan, but when she finished, he did not speak of revenge. He spoke of alignment. "You cannot build a life," he said calmly, "on a lie you tell to protect someone else's ego." Lauren stared at the fireplace, watching the flames consume seasoned wood with ruthless elegance. For 5 years, she had dimmed her name, dimmed her instinct, dimmed her authority. She had believed love required shrinking. Now she understood that concealment had not made her marriage stronger. It had made it fragile. Richard leaned forward slightly, his voice steady. "The Sterling Charity Gala is next week. I had intended to host it alone this year. I think it is time the city remembers my daughter." The words were not a command. They were an invitation. A slow breath moved through Lauren's lungs. The gala had always been more than an event. It was a convergence of power, philanthropy, and influence, attended by senators, executives, financiers, and media magnates. For 5 years, she had avoided it, citing travel or projects. She had not wanted David asking questions she was not ready to answer. Now, the irony was almost poetic. He and Amber were counting on that very gala to elevate his career, unaware that the woman he discarded held the authority to redefine the room entirely. She rose from her chair and walked toward the window, the Atlantic stretching endlessly beyond the glass. The woman who had clipped grocery coupons and negotiated contractor discounts was still part of her, but so was the strategist raised in boardrooms worth billions. When she turned back to her father, her eyes no longer held hesitation. "I will host it," she said quietly. "Not for spectacle, not for humiliation, for reclamation." Richard nodded once, satisfied not with vengeance but with clarity. The dragon had not awakened in rage. It had awakened in control. The boutique on Fifth Avenue required appointments months in advance, its windows guarded not by security alone but by reputation. Inside, silence reigned like a private agreement among those who could afford to belong. Lauren entered without spectacle, dressed in tailored cream trousers and a silk blouse the color of moonlight, her hair falling in soft waves over one shoulder. No one announced her name. No one needed to. The manager spotted her within seconds and straightened instinctively, recognition flashing behind carefully trained discretion. Sterling airs did not cue. They were accommodated. Lauren moved slowly through the rack's fingertips, grazing velvet and satin, her expression unreadable. She was not there to shop. She was there to observe. The Sterling Charity Gala was 3 days away, and the fashion world already hummed with speculation over who would dominate the staircase that evening. Designers had prepared exclusive pieces, knowing cameras would capture every seam. Lauren paused before a silver evening gown cut with architectural precision, its fabric catching light like liquid metal. It was elegant, powerful, unapologetically commanding. She allowed herself a faint smile. It would do. A familiar voice shattered the quiet. "Oh my God, David, this is the one." Amber Collins's reflection appeared in the mirrored wall before Lauren turned. Amber stood across the room in a fitted crimson dress, hair immaculately styled, a sales associate hovering nervously at her side. David lingered behind her, checking his phone, his expression tight with financial calculation. Lauren watched them without moving, the air thick with impending irony. Amber spotted her within seconds and laughed sharply. "You again? Are you following us, or is this just your natural habitat for pretending?" David's gaze locked onto Lauren, surprise flickering into annoyance. He took in her polished appearance, the effortless composure, and something unsettled crossed his face. Amber, however, did not notice. She held up a shimmering silver gown nearly identical to the one Lauren had just selected. "This is the dress I'm wearing to the Sterling Gala," she declared loudly. $20,000, but worth every penny. I'll look like I belong." The word lingered in the air, heavy with implication. Lauren tilted her head slightly, studying the fabric with clinical calm. She could almost hear her father's voice discussing acquisitions. Timing is everything. The boutique manager approached Lauren, discreetly awaiting instruction. She did not raise her voice. She did not glance at Amber. "I will take the entire platinum collection," she said smoothly. "Every piece. Have it delivered to the Hamptons estate by tomorrow afternoon." The manager nodded immediately, already calculating figures in the hundreds of thousands. Amber froze mid-sentence, confusion replacing arrogance. "What do you mean, the entire collection?" she demanded, her voice sharpening. The sales associate looked helplessly between them. "I'm afraid the line is now exclusively reserved," the manager explained carefully, addressing Amber with professional politeness, "including the silver gown." Amber's face flushed crimson to match her dress. "That's ridiculous. I was here first." Lauren finally turned her gaze fully toward her, cool and unwavering. "Class," she said quietly, "cannot be rushed." The words were not cruel. They were precise. David felt the shift, then something dawning too late. He recognized the authority in Lauren's tone, the subtle deference in the staff's posture. It did not align with the narrative he had constructed about her smallness. Amber's composure fractured. She accused the boutique of discrimination, threatened to call the owner, flaunted the credit card David had given her. Lauren watched without expression, knowing that very card's limit existed because she had authorized it years ago. The irony felt almost poetic. As she signed the purchase order, her signature elegant and steady, she understood that this was not revenge. It was repositioning. She was reclaiming space that had always been hers. When she left the boutique, the silver gown secured, she did not look back. Inside, Amber's voice rose in frustrated disbelief, but for the first time her laughter held no power. The ballroom of the Sterling Imperial Hotel shimmered like a constellation brought to earth. 10,000 white orchids cascaded from the ceiling, their petals glowing beneath crystal chandeliers that fractured light into liquid brilliance. A live orchestra tuned their instruments softly near the grand staircase, violins whispering anticipation into the air. Outside, a procession of black cars lined the curb, their polished surfaces reflecting camera flashes and whispered speculation. The Sterling Charity Gala was not merely an event. It was a declaration of influence. And tonight, influence would shift. Lauren stood in the private suite above the ballroom, the silver gown draped over her frame like sculpted starlight. It fit her with quiet authority, the fabric falling in precise lines that suggested strength rather than fragility. A sapphire and diamond necklace rested at her collarbone, understated but unmistakably rare. She studied her reflection without vanity, assessing not beauty but presence. For 5 years she had softened herself to preserve someone else's comfort. Tonight she would not diminish. Her father stood behind her, adjusting his cufflinks, pride and resolve blending seamlessly in his expression. Below, David and Amber arrived in a rented limousine that attempted grandeur but failed to mask aging headlights and subtle wear. Amber wore a bright crimson gown, purchased hastily after the boutique humiliation, its sequins loud, its cut aggressive. She smiled at photographers who barely noticed her, her confidence rehearsed but brittle. David adjusted his tie repeatedly, sweat gathering at his temples despite the evening chill. He carried a leather portfolio beneath his arm, convinced that securing a contract with Sterling Global would elevate his career beyond imagination. He did not know the majority stake in his firm had quietly changed hands that morning. Inside, a steward directed them to table 19. It stood near the service doors, partially obscured by a towering arrangement of greenery, the hum of waitstaff constant behind them. Amber's expression tightened. There must be a mistake, she hissed. David forced a thin smile, unwilling to cause a scene. Around them, billionaires occupied the front tables. Senators laughed over champagne, executives exchanged strategic glances. The air pulsed with calculated civility. Amber downed her drink, quickly irritation simmering beneath lacquered composure. David scanned the room for Richard Sterling, desperate for proximity to power he believed he deserved. The lights dimmed without warning. Conversations dissolved into expectant silence as a spotlight ignited at the top of the grand staircase. The master of ceremonies announced Richard Sterling with reverent clarity, his voice echoing through marble and glass. Applause swelled as the patriarch appeared, commanding without effort. He descended slowly, then paused halfway, raising a hand to quiet the room. "This year," he said smoothly, "I am not your only host." A ripple of curiosity passed through the audience like a gust of wind across water. Another spotlight ignited. At the top of the staircase stood Lauren. The silver gown caught the light and scattered it across the room like shattered stars. Her posture was unyielding, her expression calm, sovereign. Gasps rippled through the crowd. David leaned forward, confusion knitting his brow before recognition struck with violent clarity. Amber's fingers tightened around the edge of the tablecloth, color draining from her face. The woman they had mocked in boutiques and ballrooms now descended with measured grace, her hand resting lightly on her father's arm. Lauren reached the final step and faced the room. She did not smile broadly. She did not perform. She simply existed in her rightful space, and the atmosphere recalibrated around her. David felt the ground tilt beneath him, memories colliding with revelation. The Toyota, the coupons, the freelance invoices. Each fragment rearranged into a truth he had never considered. At table 19, silence wrapped around him like a vice. Amber whispered, "That's impossible," but the room's deference told a different story. Power had not entered the ballroom, it had revealed itself. Silence can be louder than accusation. As Lauren reached the center of the ballroom floor, the orchestra stilled and every whispered conversation dissolved into a charged hush that pressed against the ribs. Richard Sterling stepped aside without theatrics, allowing his daughter the space that had always been hers. Lauren's silver gown shimmered under the chandelier light, but it was her composure that commanded the room. She did not rush to the microphone. She allowed the weight of recognition to settle, first watching as confusion turned to realization on faces that had dismissed her only days before. David rose halfway from his chair at table 19, then froze. His mind scrambled through memories with desperate speed. The unexplained credit approvals, the interest rate adjustments, the reservations that materialized with a single call from Lauren. He remembered how the bank had reversed a rejection within hours, how the dealership had apologized profusely before handing him the keys to his leased BMW. He had framed those moments as proof of his growing status. Now they reassembled into something far more unsettling. Across from him, Amber's knuckles blanched around her champagne flute, the yellow diamond on her finger catching the light with mocking brilliance. Lauren finally spoke, her voice amplified but measured smooth as tempered steel. She welcomed the guests with gratitude, acknowledged the Foundation's charitable initiatives, and then paused with deliberate calm. "Sterling Global," she said, her gaze sweeping the room, "is built on integrity and long-term partnerships. We invest in people who understand that foundations matter." Her eyes drifted unhurried toward the back of the ballroom where David stood visibly trembling. The spotlight did not need to follow her gaze. The shift in atmosphere did that work on its own. Richard stepped forward once more, holding a leather portfolio identical to the one clutched in David's hand. Before tonight's pledges, he continued, "There is a corporate matter to address." Murmurs rippled through the guests, subtle but electric. A screen descended behind them, elegant and massive. With a single click, documents illuminated the marble walls, acquisition agreements, stock transfers, signatures, rendered in unassailable clarity. Lauren did not look away from David as the truth unfolded publicly. This morning, she stated evenly, Sterling Global finalized a majority acquisition of Carter Architectural Group. The words struck like a physical blow. David's breath left him in a stunned exhale, the room tilting violently in his perception. He stared at the screen as percentages glowed unmistakably above 51%. Control, ownership, authority. His authority evaporated in seconds. "This is a mistake," he whispered, though no one had accused him of anything yet. Amber leaned toward him, voice cracking with disbelief. "You said you were meeting them to negotiate," she hissed, panic fracturing her polish. But there was no negotiation left to conduct. Lauren descended the final steps from the platform and approached the microphone again, closer now, her presence undeniable. "Integrity," she repeated softly, "also applies to personal conduct." Another click. A new display surfaced, financial summaries from a supplementary credit account issued under the Sterling Prime Trust. The room absorbed the implication before she spoke it. Over the past 5 years, numerous personal expenses were covered through funds authorized under my discretion. She did not need to elaborate. The diamond ring on Amber's trembling hand seemed suddenly heavy, conspicuous. David's humiliation unfolded not through shouting, but through arithmetic. Every indulgence, every dinner, every whispered promise to Amber had been financed by the woman he called small. His shoulders sagged as understanding crystallized. He had not risen independently. He had been carried. Amber attempted a protest, her voice sharp and brittle. That ring was a gift she insisted, though even she recognized the fragility of the claim. Lauren's expression did not harden. It clarified. Assets acquired under misrepresented authorization, she said, evenly constitute liability. Security did not drag anyone. There was no theatrical removal. The consequences were procedural, precise, devastating in their quiet efficiency. A representative from Sterling Financial approached Table 19 with formal documentation. The supplementary account had been frozen. The BMW lease, signed under corporate guarantee, had been revoked. Amber's diamond, legally tied to misused trust funds, was requested for immediate return pending review. The ballroom watched not with cruelty, but with sobering fascination, as power corrected imbalance without raising its voice. Lauren turned back to the audience, reclaiming the evening with seamless composure. "We gather tonight to support futures built on honesty and resilience," she concluded. Applause erupted slowly at first, then with conviction, not for spectacle, but for clarity. David remained standing, hollowed by revelation. Amber slid the ring from her finger with trembling hands. In that moment, beneath crystal chandeliers and camera flashes, Lauren did not look triumphant. She looked free. The doors of the Sterling Imperial Hotel closed behind David with a sound that echoed far longer than it should have. Outside, Manhattan pulsed with indifferent life headlights streaking across wet pavement. Distant sirens blending into the rhythm of a city that did not pause for fallen men. The cold air cut through his thin tuxedo as if stripping away the last illusion of control he clung to. He stood there for a moment, unmoving, as if waiting for someone to call him back to say there had been a mistake, that the last hour had been some elaborate misunderstanding. No one did. Behind those doors, music resumed, laughter returned, and the world continued without him. Amber did not stand beside him for long. She had already pulled away her fingers, red from forcing the diamond ring off her swollen knuckle. The stone that had once symbolized her imagined ascent now sat sealed in an evidence envelope, its brilliance dulled by legality. Her mascara had run in uneven lines down her cheeks, her composure fractured beyond repair. "You ruined everything," she snapped, her voice hollow and sharp at once. There was no trace of admiration left in her eyes, only accusation. When a taxi slowed at the curb, she climbed in without looking back, disappearing into the city with the same urgency she once used to chase status. David watched the taillights vanish, realizing too late that what he had mistaken for partnership had always been opportunism. He began to walk without direction. Each step felt heavier than the last, his polished shoes slipping slightly against rain-slick pavement. The city lights blurred as memories surfaced uninvited. Lauren standing in their kitchen, quietly placing dinner on the table. Lauren answering calls that mysteriously solved problems he could not fix. Lauren smiling gently when he spoke about ambitions she had already surpassed before she turned 20. He had not lost her in a single moment. He had dismissed her piece by piece, replacing substance with spectacle until nothing real remained. The realization did not arrive with anger. It arrived with a hollow weight that settled deep in his chest. The following morning offered no redemption. At 9 o'clock, he stood outside his office building, the same glass tower he had entered with pride for years. His access card failed on the first attempt, then again on the second, the red light blinking with mechanical finality. A security guard he barely recognized approached holding a small cardboard box containing the remnants of his professional identity. "I'm sorry," the man said quietly, though the apology carried no authority to change the outcome. Sterling Global had completed a full audit overnight. His position had been terminated. His firm, once his greatest achievement, now operated under leadership that did not include him. Days stretched into weeks and weeks into something heavier, quieter. The divorce finalized without drama, the paperwork handled by a team of attorneys who never needed Lauren's physical presence to assert her will. David walked away with nothing beyond personal debt accumulated from maintaining a lifestyle he could no longer afford. The BMW was gone. The apartment lease collapsed under unpaid balances. Opportunities vanished before they could materialize, his name carrying the weight of public disgrace no employer wished to inherit. The city that once felt like a ladder now felt like a wall. 6 months later, he stood behind the counter of a hardware store in Queens, hands roughened by labor shoulders permanently lowered. The work was honest, simple, and devoid of illusion. During his lunch break, he sat on a wooden crate in the alley behind the building, unwrapping a sandwich with slow, methodical movements. A newspaper lay discarded beside him, its pages rustling softly in the wind. When it flipped open, his eyes caught a photograph that stilled his breath. Lauren stood at the center of the image, wearing a tailored white blazer and a safety helmet, her posture confident against the backdrop of a rising steel structure. The headline named her clearly the new face of strategic acquisitions, the woman reshaping the city skyline with precision and vision. Beside her stood a man David did not recognize, his expression steady, his presence unforced. They were not posed for spectacle. They looked aligned. Lauren's smile was different from the one he remembered. It was not softened to reassure someone else. It was full, unguarded, entirely her own. David stared at the image longer than necessary, absorbing the final truth that no revelation at the gala had fully delivered. He had not simply lost wealth. He had lost the one person who had quietly made him stronger without demanding recognition. Inside the store, his manager called his name, the sound cutting through reflection with practical urgency. David folded the newspaper carefully and set it aside, as if preserving something he no longer had the right to hold. He stood, wiped his hands against his apron, and returned to work without protest. The life he once feared had become his reality, stripped of illusion, defined by consequence. And somewhere across the city, in rooms built on decisions rather than appearances. Lauren Sterling continued forward without looking back. Her silence no longer a shield, but a choice. Stories like Lauren's are not really about wealth. From a deeper expert perspective, they are about identity power and the quiet danger of self-erasure in relationships. When someone diminishes their own value to sustain love, they do not create harmony. They create imbalance. And imbalance over time invites disrespect. David did not fall because he chased money. He fell because he failed to recognize true value when it stood beside him every day. Lauren, on the other hand, did not rise because she was rich. She rose because she finally chose herself. If this story made you reflect, take a second to like and subscribe so you don't miss more stories that reveal the hidden truths behind power relationships and human nature. And I'm curious, what do you think this story really represents? Comment below with just 3 words, know your worth.